Okay, this is lecture 3 of McGerr. Pull up the notes here. Okay, so lecture 3 is going to, or chapter 5 is going to talk about the great problems posed by big business. I'm going to talk a little bit about vertically integrated business in just a second. But as McGerr sees it, there are 3 big problems that are posed by business interests at this time. Number 1, you have the emergence of large-scale enterprises. These are corporations that are growing in tremendous size and power. Part of this is because businesses are becoming vertically integrated to increase their efficiency. So vertical integration means the process is owned by a company or corporation from start to finish. So let's talk about steel. So steel is manufactured by heating ores, primarily iron ore, and then adding other ores into that until they melt, and then you add in carbon and you pound out the impurities and add more carbon and heat it and cool it, and in such fashion you produce a finished product, steel, right? That's clearly greatly simplifying the process, but nonetheless, that's generally how it works. So making steel works most efficiently on the large scale. So you have a big steel mill with furnaces and lots of workers making this finished product of steel. But in order to make that steel, you need the raw ingredients. So you can purchase the ingredients, and companies do, and that's how you make a profit, right? A company who owns the mine digs the ore out of the ground, sells it to a steel making company, and so they make a profit. Well, you can increase your efficiency and cut what it costs for you to produce this by buying the iron mine yourself, right? So a vertically integrated company, the finished product is steel, and there's actually a process after that. I'll talk about it as well. But the finished product is steel. You own the factory, but the factory requires these materials in order to manufacture it. So a vertically integrated company wants to own where the source of this material comes from, the iron mines, right? So the iron mines produce the iron ore, which is used in making steel. You own coal that you, through a process known as coking it, turn it into a higher heating product, right? So owning your own coal mines and owning your own coking facilities is also part of the process that allows you to produce this. So in the case of iron mines, many iron mines are located in upstate Michigan, right? So to get the iron ore from your mines, which you own in Michigan, to your steel mill in Pittsburgh, you have to transport it. So instead of paying somebody else to transport it, you own or buy or build your own shipping company. So on the lake, the Great Lakes, you own your own shipping company and you transport the iron ore from your mine along rail lines you own to ships that you own that then floated across the Great Lakes to Erie, which is on the Great Lakes, and then from there you put it on your own rail cars who deliver it to the factory. You then use the components you own to manufacture your finished product steel, and then it continues on the backside. The steel companies would then own the salesmen as well, who'd be working for the company. So a vertically integrated company, from the earliest raw materials to the finished product, even to the marketing of that, is owned by the same company. Now, this gives companies an enormous advantage. Competitors who are purchasing steel from an iron mine or putting it on the ships that somebody else owns, along the way have to pay a little bit of profit. This is a profit-driven industry. So their costs are a little higher than yours if you're a vertically integrated company, because really the only place you have to make a profit is when you sell it. So this, in theory, is a much more efficient production because you don't pay anybody else profits until you go to sell the product. So you can sell your product cheaper and so capture more of the market. And capturing more of the market allows another element of this, this process to unfold too. And it's called the power of bigness. Big companies are able to purchase raw material in greater bulk and so pay cheaper costs for it, simply because of the sheer size of the purchase, right? Just a simple example. Walmart can sell socks cheaper because the per unit profit for each sock may be so small, let's say a penny, that why would anybody sell socks you manufacture for a penny profit? It doesn't make any sense unless the company is buying so many socks that those pennies add up. So Walmart says, I'll buy 1 million socks from you at a penny a profit above your cost. And so it'll still be worthwhile for you to do it. Whereas if you're selling to a smaller mom and pop one, why would you sell socks a penny profit? You would need more money to make it worthwhile for you to do it. So mom and pops have to pay a higher cost for exactly the same product, because the company selling it or producing the socks and selling it wants to make the profits worthwhile. It's not worthwhile for a small batch for a couple of pennies, whereas a big company like Walmart buying millions of socks, then a penny a sock turns out to be a tidy profit, right? So because of that, the sheer size of the companies allows them to lower their costs even further, right? Because their raw materials you're able to purchase them cheaper, so you produce the product cheaper, so you sell it cheaper, and so capture more of the market, driving your competitors out. The sheer size of your company allows you to pressure other companies. You can buy them out. You can, as John Rockefeller used to do with Standard Oil, he called it sweating. So if a competitor wouldn't sell to him, sell their company to him, because John Rockefeller wanted to capture all the companies that were competitors, and he made it attractive to them by saying, I'll give you some shares in my company if you'll sell me your company, right? But people that resisted him, well, then John Rockefeller would sweat them out. And what he would do would be to cut the prices that he would sell things at that were in competition with others, even to the point of selling them at a loss. Because John Rockefeller Standard Oil had such deep pockets, he could sustain short-term losses for a much longer period of time in order to drive his competitor out of business. And when his competitor, a month or 2 months later, he would approach him again and say, would you like to sell to me now? And even if he still said no, he would drive the other company into bankruptcy and then so capture the market. And then because he has a monopoly, he can raise the price and recapture the money he lost by the sweating operation, right? And so all these things allow companies, when they begin to generate, they become self-sustaining. They're able in capturing market share. The sheer scale of them allows them to produce it cheaper. The sheer deep pockets they have, they can force or coerce their competitors to join them or force them out of business. And so the effect is that the companies become larger still. And so increasingly, instead of a number of companies operating, as we'll see in just a few moments, you have a smaller number of companies who are controlling much larger percentages of the market share and are then able to rig the system to benefit themselves. Second, these great large corporations are economically interdependent. And so they have a greater and increasing impact on the nation's economy. So let's think about the steel mill again. Let's say Carnegie Steel, which became, before Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company to U.S. Steel, became the largest steel manufacturer on the planet, right? So Andrew Carnegie Steel Company, he owned the steel company, he owned shipping lines on the Great Lakes, he owned railroad lines that were delivering goods, he owned the iron mines in the upstate Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right? So all these places, Andrew Carnegie has a reach, right? Because his companies, which are very large, have impact in a variety of places around the country. So Andrew Carnegie's company is linked to all sorts of different things. We saw in the previous lecture talking about the UMW strike. those coal mines were owned by rail companies because the companies were vertically integrated. So the impact of that strike doesn't just impact the coal mine operators, it impacts the railroad companies, and because they controlled such a large percentage of the amount of anthracite coal being produced, it impacted people who used it to heat their houses or companies that used it to power their engines of some sort, right? So that economic interdependence is because of a strike against one set of company owners, the mine owners, but they have an enormous impact. There's also an increasing realization in the early 20th century of something that it took a long time for the American companies and Americans in general to realize, that this, that there are economic limits, that things can be used up, that supplies can be exhausted. There is a realization that the raw materials or the goods of this nation are finite, not infinite. Now that seems to be a normal occurrence or a normal thought today, but it was really kind of a hard-learned lesson. And I'll give you a simple example. When Europeans, colonists showed up on the east coast of North America, the land was so forested that this is, there's truth in this, but it's, it's not exactly accurate. There is a saying that a squirrel could mount the treetop cover on the beaches of the Atlantic Ocean and not have to descend until he hit the Mississippi River, right? That there was so much forest land that it appeared to be infinite. And so in the early colonial period, there was a sense there was so much of this raw material of lumber that we could never use it up. There was so much forest that we couldn't use it all up. And then they clear cut New England, right? And then that was clear cut, so those businesses went out of business or had to move further into the interior, where across the Ohio and the old Northwest, as it was referred to, or the Northwest as it referred to at that time, they cut down all those trees. And so after they cut down all those trees, then they encountered the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin. And they said, there's so many trees here, we can never use them all up. And then they clear cut all the trees in the northern Midwestern states. And then they turned their eyes to the southern pine forest. And they said, there's so many southern pine forests that we couldn't possibly cut them all down. And then they clear cut the southern pine forest even more quickly than they had clear cut the upper Midwest. And so by the early 20th century, as this business is of large scale lumbering is moving across the country, the last stand of large scale forests was the Great Northwest. And there's increasingly a recognition that we can use this all up. Because after we clear cut the forests of the Great Northwest, there would be no forest left to cut down, that everything could be used up. And so there was increasingly a recognition in the early 20th century that resources are finite and that we can't just use them up in such rapid fashion, right? And so we're going to talk about something that is associated with that, known as conservation, just a few moments. The larger question that McGerr says, this is bringing to the fore a question: can business still operate without oversight, right? Is this process something that can continue in the way it can or has been, or is it something that a new process is going to have to emerge? Well, what it becomes clear is that as the example of lumber demonstrates, a new process is going to have to emerge because the old style practice of cutting everything down will use it all up. So in the early 20th century, the turn of the 20th century, we have a structural transformation of the economy. It's known as consolidation. Now, I should note that in the 1890s, there was a bitter recession which contributed to this process, right? So some of this is companies being driven out of business by this fierce recession and companies forced together in other fashions. But it's a massive consolidation across a number of industrial sectors or factory producing sectors of this nation. In 1897, there were 1,800 companies making stuff, right? By 1904, those companies had combined or been driven to extinction or forcibly taken over so that there were only 157 companies. And these 157 companies are much larger than those previous 1,800 companies. So you have a consolidation process resulting in big business and corporate foundation of corporate organization of various business sectors. So there's good and bad to this. So I don't want to say that, you know, there's not just all bad things about it. So there's good. This system is much more efficient, right? Instead of companies competing with one another, they're able to efficiently produce goods for a variety of markets so that there's not overproduction of certain things, right? So there is some good. The efficiency of these companies, these large-scale companies, are much more efficient. There's also greater pools of capital that these companies can draw upon and use more effectively. So what does that mean? A company producing stuff that's a small company could produce more and make more money if it had a bigger factory, but it doesn't have enough capital to build that bigger factory, right? So it doesn't have the money to expand, even though if it could expand, it would become bigger and capture more of the market. Simply because it doesn't have that pool of money to draw upon, it can expand and become a more efficient company, right? And also because there's so many companies competing in this market, their profit margins are much lower, so they can't create that pile of money to use to make the company more efficient. These larger companies have larger pools of capital that they can draw upon to improve the efficiency of their production or distribution or whatever. So there is some good that's associated with this consolidation movement. There's also bad, because consolidation allows for the creation of monopolies, pools, and trusts. And pools and trusts, and this is not a trust like your family trust where you put money away and you inherit it. This is a business term of a trust. And what that means is you have companies. So a monopoly is when one company controls the majority of the market share. So let's say Standard Oil, right? So Standard Oil had a monopoly in producing oil. They owned, it was a vertically integrated company. John Rockefeller created a vertically integrated company where they owned some oil fields themselves, right? So they're producing oil fields themselves. They also owned the derrick system, or they would use them themselves as a vertically integrated company, would also lend them out at cost with a profit to their competitors. So he's involved in that. He created storage system, tanks, pipelines, rail cars, carrying some of this stuff, his stuff and his competitors, right? But where John Rockefeller's true monopoly choke point came in this system was turning the raw, petroleum products into finished goods known as refining, right? So John Rockefeller had a stranglehold on the refinery market. He had a monopoly. So he could not only produce his gasoline, diesel, kerosene, the various sorts of products you make from crude oil, right, as you refine it into its constituent parts that have markets. Not only could he produce its stuff for himself at cost, and so produce and sell it at a cheaper price and capture more of the market, he also, because he controlled more than 85% of the refinery producing capacity in this nation, he could charge his competitors whatever he wanted. So this allowed him to make profits on his competitors who needed to use John Rockefeller's and Standard Oil's refinery capacity. So they made profits on that. And then they also, he could jack the price up further, making his competitors' product more expensive, so allowing him to capture more of the market. So monopolies dictate the market, and so they're not responsive to market pressures, because there is no market pressure. Because they control the majority of such a market, then they can charge whatever they want, and so that's what you have to pay. So monopolies are good for the monopoly owners, but they're bad for other corporations. And pools and trusts operate in similar fashion. Instead of having one company who controls this, you have a small number of companies who decide to combine together and add their market share together, so that between the 3 or 4 of them, Pools don't work if they get too big, because then people try and cheat and undercut each other. But when you have a small number of companies that are agreeing to set a price, they set a price between the three of them. They collude and conspire on setting this price, which benefits the companies, and it adversely impacts the consuming public, right? Because the market's not working to make them keep their prices low and or increase the efficiency or the quality of their product. Because they're so large, they're just dictating the terms and setting the profits for themselves and are not responsive to market demands. The way to think about this is the idea behind self-regulating markets is that there's the invisible hand of the market, which serves as a rewarder for good actors and a punisher for bad actors, right? Good actors are rewarded because people spend their money with them. People who are producing poorly or not the best market price that they could, people don't buy their stuff because it's more expensive and or shoddy, right? But when there's only 2 or 3 companies and they're colluding on price, you can't go anywhere else to purchase this material. So they're setting things to benefit themselves. They set a price that allows them to make higher profits, and they're not responsive to the consumer's needs because the invisible hand of the market can't punish them. There's nobody else to buy from, right? So this structural transformation, the consolidation movement, has transformed the business and industrial community of the nation. Combined all these things, McGerr says there's 5 possible responses to this consolidation and big business corporatization movement. Number 1, there's the do nothing, laissez-faire approach. Laissez-faire means leave alone, right? So do nothing. This has been the traditional American response up until this point in dealing with businesses. It's up to the business owners. We let the market decide whether or not they're doing good or bad things. The invisible hand of the market will reward good actors and punish bad ones. So we shouldn't, as an outside entity, get involved, let the business regulate itself. Well, the problem is you can't do that as much anymore because the businesses have gotten so large that they're creating monopolies, pools, and trusts, which are designed to maximize the profits of the businesses and not serve the consumers, right? There's also a sense that things are getting used up, right? So the market system is why people are driven to maximize short-term profits, like clear-cutting a forest, right, to maximize your return, because if you don't cut it down and take out what's valuable, your competitor will. So there's this incentive to do things more rapidly and more wastefully in order to capture the assets first, right? So the do nothing response, it had been the standard response for American interactions with the business sector. We can't do it as much anymore, or so the thinking was. Second, you go the exact opposite. So instead of independent businesses making their own decisions, there's a socialist solution. The socialist solution is, instead of private individuals owning these important business sectors, the government or the public owns it, right? So the socialist response is the polar opposite of the laissez-faire response. We should have the people own it or the government own it, right? The third, an antitrust response, in which these big businesses are broken up into smaller pieces because big businesses are monopolizing various sectors, or they're so large they're not competing with one another, they're colluding. The thing to do is to break them up into smaller companies, which then compete with one another, right? So the antitrust, which was drawing upon the passage of congressional law known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890. The fourth possible response is regulation, right? Using the power of the government to oversee business actions and activities to protect the public, right? Some sort of entity, outside entity, a government entity, to ensure that businesses are operating fairly, right? Fairly, so that they're not, they're not adversely affecting the public, but protecting the public from these large businesses. And then the fifth possible response is compensation, right? So companies are making large profits and they're having adverse effect. So compensation says we tax these companies, capture some of their profits, and then use that to fix whatever the detrimental things they are doing. So if an oil refinery is producing toxic air that's destroying somebody's fruit trees or causing ill health, or they're dumping things into the stream that are destroying the ability of the stream to be used for any other process, capturing taxation from those companies in compensation, then using that tax money to clean up the stream or to compensate the owner of the fruit tree farm who has lost his product, right? So these are 5 possible responses. As we shall see in the progressive era, the overwhelming number 1 response is regulation, although there is significant antitrust. And there's also changes in taxation to offset to some degree this imposing taxes on the profits of large companies in order to do so. Talking about antitrust, Teddy Roosevelt, who, as I said, started off sort of as a moderate and over the course of his presidency increasingly became moved further left, right, in this reform and regulation movement, also styled himself the trust buster, right? And so he wanted to use this Sherman antitrust law to break up these large companies to protect the rights of consumers, right? The 2 major antitrust actions that he began, one was against the railroad consolidation, in which 2 large railroad companies were competing for the access to the Chicago market. And so instead of competing, they decided to form one large holding company in which both the large owners would hold shares, and together they would create this new entity that would run this profitable railroad business, generating high profits for themselves and charging the consumers more because there's no other rail company you could put it on. So the Roosevelt administration set off an effort using Sherman antitrust law to break up that holding company and break up this control of the railroads by such a small number of hands. Another example is Standard Oil. John Rockefeller suggested that breaking up Standard Oil would bankrupt him and he'd be dead broke, but in the Standard Oil, which was operating in many places as a monopoly, generating higher profits for Standard Oil and penalizing the consumers by increasing high prices and the inability to find a competitor. Standard Oil was broken up into smaller parts. Some of the refinery businesses were spun off into different entities. And so, as it turned out, breaking up and selling off Standard Oil actually turned into much greater wealth for John Rockefeller than owning the company. It's important to recognize that Sherman Antitrust Act, the government doesn't take Standard Oil away from John Rockefeller. It says Standard Oil must sell off pieces of the company, but John Rockefeller gets to keep the profits of selling it off. It turns out the petroleum business was so lucrative that selling off parts of the company set off a bidding war, which John Rockefeller capitalized by selling these products, becoming, in the early 20th century, a billionaire and the wealthiest man on the planet. Okay. So there is use of antitrust legislation. Teddy Roosevelt styled himself the trust buster, but actually it was his successor, William Howard Taft, who actually initiated, it was his administration that initiated more antitrust efforts. The other type, or the major source of government response or response to big business that takes a form of government response is regulation. This is where a government entity, the federal government, as Teddy Roosevelt pushed very hard to do, interposes itself between the producers and the public in order to protect the public. And this regulation, a couple of famous famous pieces of legislation grew out of this effort, right? So first, it's important to recognize these things don't pop up overnight, that there had been an increasing recognition that the unregulated food and drug business represented a threat to the nation's health, right? Because there was nobody who was requiring that companies produce things safely or produce things that won't cause harm to the consumer, that leaving it up to the market meant that nobody was overseeing it, just the invisible hand of the market. And there had been some spectacularly bad outcomes of this, of people being poisoned by medicines or becoming addicted, or poisoned by the food they were consuming. So regulation, there was a longer term concern over food and drugs that was increasing pressure on Congress to pass some sort of legislation to protect the public. What really brought it to the fore was the publication of, first in a serial fashion, from a press down in southeastern Kansas. Socialist press was serializing this story that was later collected into the book known as The Jungle. Now, The Jungle is, it should be known at the outset, is a fictional account, right? It's a story written by Upton Sinclair, whose goal is not to lead to increased regulation of the meatpacking industry, but instead was designed to illustrate how unrestrained capitalism is an evil thing and promoted socialist reform, right? Upton Sinclair was a socialist. He supposedly said, maybe apocryphal, he said, I aim for the nation's heart, but I hit it in the stomach. So his account is the story of Packingtown, right? And it's to this immigrant couple who come to America in pursuit of the American dream and end up working in Packingtown at a meat packing plant. The intent is to illustrate what happens when capitalism operates without restraint. And the idea was that this is ruining the American dream, and instead we should, adopt socialist practices, which will lead us to a utopia that's better for everyone. That's the gist. It's a fictional story. The immigrant couple didn't really exist. In his account, he shows not only the working conditions, but the production methods of a large meatpacking company in Packington, right? So in this, the accounts talk about old tinned products, old canned meat that was sent out for sale that did not sell, and so came back to the factory, and the old labels were steamed off and new ones slapped on and then sent out again for sale. It told stories of people working on the line. When you work on what's known as the disassembly line, where you're breaking down a carcass into its constituent parts. This is a dangerous business, and people would lose their fingers or get mangled in this process, and the line wouldn't stop. So somebody would lose their finger and it'd still be in the food processing line, right? Told the story of what we now call downer cattle, right? So cattle that are by law, they have to be able to walk into the slaughterhouse. If they can't walk into the slaughterhouse or they're visibly ill, you're not supposed to use them. But these downer cattle, when the local inspector went home for the day or took his 2-hour lunch paid for with company money, they would take the animals that were unable to walk or were sick or whatever from the rail cars and take them in and process. This processing method produced what they call offal, which are the innards that would pile up, that would attract predators, so they would, or scavengers, so there were rats running around Packington, and so they would also put out poison to poison the rats. The rats would be eating this stuff, and then at regular times, they would shovel up this offal and dump it into a processing line where they would turn it into sausage. He reported of somebody operating on the line who fell into the rendering machine and was rendered into lard, which was shipped out, right? Now, again, this is a fictional account. So when the story came out, people were horrified. And then they found out the story behind the story, right? So the overall story is a fiction, but Upton Sinclair said everything that occurred in the book in terms of the processing are things that I directly observed. And here's how he observed them. He went to the Armour meat packing company. And it's a huge operation. There were 3 large meat packing companies in Chicago, Armour, Swift, and I think the other one is National, right? So these 3 companies are the massive companies who are processing meat, right? Selling the steaks, but also selling tinned beef, selling the various parts of the animal for the market. And so it's a huge operation. So for a month, Upton Sinclair walked in when the factory opened with all the other workers. And then he wandered around the plant. And he said he would carry stuff, right? So if he would walk through a room carrying something and would observe the process, right? And things that he was really interested in, he'd come back with something else, right? And in this fashion, he went through the entire plant over the course of the month observing things. And then in the aftermath, he would go to the taverns and talk to the workers and get their stories. And he said, every single thing I discussed about in terms of that fictional account in the meatpacking plant are things I directly observed, except for the person falling into the rendering thing that killed the worker, and he ended up in the lard processing, right? He said, that was something the workers told me about. He goes, I did not see it, but everything else I directly observed. And so that's why he said, I aimed at the nation's heart, but I hit in the stomach, because people were outraged and nauseated by this food production. And so one of those people who were outraged was Teddy Roosevelt, who, again, this could be apocryphal, supposedly read these accounts of what was going on in the meatpacking plant while he was eating his breakfast sausage, right? So who knows whether or not for sure that's true, but that's what the story reads. But at any rate, what it reveals in the jungle was that the company was operating in an unregulated fashion, and it was operating in ways that were detrimental to the public's health. The revelations of the jungle prompted a government response, and the Roosevelt administration ordered the plants inspected, and the inspection of the plants pretty much validated everything that Upton Sinclair wrote about. All the things he wrote about, the government inspectors saw as well, right? So this revealed what was going on. And so here I want to shift just for a quick second from the perspective of the consumer, right, to this perspective of the owner. The owner, in this case, Armour, who was called before Congress and made the following claims, right? We don't know because he didn't produce his figures. They were figures he asserted were true, but he said he does not make a profit selling the meat from the animals he processes. The only way he turns a profit is to use all the other parts of the animal. So he cuts out the steaks and things like that, right? But selling those is not profitable. He would lose money if he just sold those. But they also use the hides, so they sell the hides, and they take the hooves and they boil them down and make glue out of them, or gelatin. And they use the hair, in which they make bristles out of, and they use other parts of the cow, or the hooves actually they also use to make buttons. So it's using all these parts, maximizing what you get out of the animal, that allows him to eke out a profit. And he says, because he's in competition with 2 other people operating in the same fashion, their profit margins are so slim that they have to maximize their efficiency. So in that worldview, a cow that has tuberculosis, which is a threat to the public's health because you can contract tuberculosis from a tubercular cow, right? The cow, you don't set out to buy a tubercular cow, but because you've already spent that money to maximize your efficiency to maintain yourself in the market, you must process it. So an animal that is a downer cow that can't walk through the processing line because he broke its leg on the, being delivered there, you bring him through and process him because you've already spent that money. You have to squeeze out every penny, right? So he argues. So the upshot of this is that the invisible hand of the market can't operate because there's no way for you to know by looking at that tin of meat on the shelf whether or not that's meat that was produced last month or 5 years ago, right? Because there's no way to know from observation. So the invisible hand of the market is thwarted. It's also thwarted because all three large companies are operating in the same fashion and they overwhelmingly control the market for these products. So you can't go anywhere else, right? They have captured the market by driving out their competitors. So the only place you can buy these things are that are under the control. The outrage over this prompted the passage of the Meat Inspection Act, in which a federal official paid for out of federal tax dollars is on the line to ensure that the food that or the meat that is being processed is safe for the public, right? The other thing that came out of it is the passage of something known as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was also passed in 1906. The Meat Inspection Act was passed in 1906, in which companies must actually list their ingredients for the products they make, and they are held accountable for what goes into their products. So to protect the public by forcing companies to safely produce material for the drug or food market, right? So these are regulatory steps undertaken by the government. And it has to be the federal government because only the federal government is large enough to interact with these large corporations. So you think again about Andrew Carnegie's steel company. His steel company is headquartered in Western Pennsylvania, but it has a reach to just about every state in the nation in some fashion, right? So how does any local state regulator regulate Andrew Carnegie's steel company, which is so large? How does any company or how does any state regulator have an oversight responsibility for something as large as United States Steel? Only the federal government has the ability to regulate these companies because these companies are so large. Now, another concept, which again is an absolutely perfect example of progressive thinking, is the notion of conservation. Now, conservation, it's different than preservation. Preservation would be closest to what we consider environmentalism today, right? Preservation means the material or the forest, the stream, the ocean, whatever, should be left in its natural state, right? So preservation means no use. It should be left as it is for future enjoyment, right? Conservation argues something different. Conservation argues for wise use, regulating this process so that it can be used for the future. And I'll give an example. There is, let's say, in an acre of forest. That acre of forest has within it, let's say, $50 worth of lumber, right? There are trees in that forest that when you chop them down and sell them will produce a profit of $50, right? So in order to capture those $50, you cut down the trees in the forest to get at the ones that are most valuable. And in such fashion, to do it rapidly, you clear cut that forest. You've taken out the $50 and now you move on to the next acre in pursuit of the next $50 worth of lumber in there, leaving behind a clear-cut forest, which is now is no longer a forest, right? It's just stump and waste, right? Companies argued that in order to capture that wealth as quickly as possible, they had to clear cut the forest in order to efficiently remove all the things that are valuable, right? In doing that, the forest no longer exists and can't be used in the future. What conservation says, and I'll talk about the person who first heads up the Forest Service, which is charged with managing this natural resource of the forest. What conservation says, okay, you have an acre of forest, right? There is $50 worth of lumber in there, right? You can clear cut it and take that $50. Or you could cut a small section of it and remove $10 worth of lumber. And then next year, cut another section and remove $10 more. And the next year, cut another section and remove another $10. And so managing that forest, only removing some of the material and letting the other trees that are not valuable continue to grow until they become valuable, means that acre of forest can produce $10 worth of lumber from now to the end of time, right? Instead of clear cutting it all and getting $50 immediately, if you manage it, you can selectively pull out the lumber that is valuable and leave the rest of the forest there for other people to enjoy, and also for things that are not economical to grow up to be economical, right? So the tree is too small to process, but if you allow it to continue to grow in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it will be valuable, right? If you manage the use of the forest wisely, you can continue to generate profits and still have the forest, or a forest, right? And so the Forest Service is operating under this mandate under a larger scale, of course, than an acre, and it's managed by an expert. How do we know he's an expert? Because he has a PhD in forestry management from a German university. That person, Gifford Pinchot, is placed in charge of managing the forest to use them wisely, to prevent companies from unrestrictedly cutting it all down, and regulating the use of this forest, both so that you have conserved the natural resource so it will continue to be there, and also that it's available for other folks. This conservation wise use, not no use, right? So preservation says no use. This forest should not be cut down at all, right? Intrinsically, it has value untouched by commercial aims. That's not what conservation is. Conservation says we can still use the resource, we just have to use it wisely so it's not destroyed, right? This notion of wise use its champion is Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, a wealthy person who believes that nature has power to test your mettle to make you a man, is something that is good for individuals and good for the nation to have. He establishes a number of parks. He's a charter member of a group known as the Boone and Crockett Club, which seeks to protect wilderness areas for the enjoyment of people to use, particularly wealthy people who hunt or fish or things like that, right? So Teddy Roosevelt establishes a number of parks and also pressures Congress to help establish the national park system. He manages, he has a mixture of preservationist ideas, but mostly is along the lines of conservation ideas, wise use, right? So Teddy's presidency, he starts in 1900, taking over for the assassinated William McKinley. And so he is president from 1900 to 1908. And over that time, as I said, he moves from the center to the left, increasingly comes to criticize business and business interests, saying these, as he coined it, the malefactors of great wealth are rigging the system to fatten their pockets to the detriment of the nation, right? So he increasingly says businesses need oversight regulation, somebody who's looking out for the interests of the public against these very large entities. For not official reasons, because there's not a constitutional amendment yet, but the unofficial reasons of George Washington having only served 2 terms, Teddy, like every previous president, feels that he should not run for another term. So Teddy declines to run for election in re-election in 1908, or re-election, I suppose, although he was vice president in 1900. And so he supports his vice president, William H. Taft. Taft, being part of the Roosevelt administration, wins election in 1908 and as Republican. Teddy Roosevelt is Republican. So the Republican Party is the party of the progressives in the early 20th century. So Taft comes in with, roughly about the center in terms of the political spectrum. But over the course of his presidency, he increasingly moves further to the right. He increasingly comes to partner with business and business interests, particularly as he's hoping to be reelected in 1912, right? So over the course of the presidency, you have it moving from someone who was in favor of progressive regulation and to one that is less in favor. All right, we'll stop there. That's it for lecture number 3, and then we will pick up next time with lecture number 4.